Hey guys, it's Dave here with the Code Quarters Hangout. This second video essentially will go over some static page creation. Essentially this will be creating a landing page, a about us page, a contact us page, a help page, the pages that you find in any kind of website. And through this, hopefully you'll understand how Ruby does routing, how controllers work, and how essentially Ruby does templating. And hopefully through this you'll have a better understanding of MVC architecture, maybe less the M since we're not going to be making any models, but definitely understand a little bit more about views and controllers. Alright guys, let's get started. So you can just get into the directory where you have your development environment or your development machine all set up. So here I am in Sandbox, and I already have my virtual machine running, so I'm just going to SSH into it. Great. So what I'm going to do is, instead of going through and kind of walking through step by step of the Code Quarters repository, I thought that maybe I should just go and create a clean project and start from scratch. That way you can have the concepts and you can compare and contrast it with the actual code that's being written for Code Quarters. But this sample application will introduce the concepts, like I said before, and hopefully that will help you understand in the broader sense how Rails incorporates all these things together. So today we're just going to go through creating some static pages and understanding how Rails glues it all together so that when you go to a certain URL, it knows how to generate and route you to the correct corresponding HTML file. Alright, so we're just going to create this example lab folder. And when you're in there, the first thing that you want to do is just set your Ruby version. We're using RBN, so we're using this version, and just put it in a .ruby version. And we're using that as our node version. Okay, great. So then you want to initialize bundle, and what's in it is just this. You want to just start Rails this way. Oops. And like I said before, I like to keep these things in a local directory. You don't have to do it this way, but I like to do it. So just install it there. And once everything is installed, you can run a bundle execute. Because Rails is installed, you can execute Rails. You can tell it to do a new project. And you can just name this whatever you want, just calling it example project. But what you want to do is you want to skip the bundle step, and you want to skip the active record. The reason for this is active record is really for SQL-based databases like MySQL, SQLite, or PostgreSQL. We're not going to be using that because we're using MongoDB. You want to skip the bundle because MongoDB is not installed. So you're going to edit the bundle, the gem file that gets created. Anyway, I'll show you. So it goes ahead and creates all the boilerplate for Rails app, and creates a folder called example project. So let's go there. If you look in there, it's created an app, binary config folder, a bunch of different stuff, but let's look at the gem file. So in this case, you might want to reference the GitHub repository and just look at the gem file there and see what you can add that's missing here. So a big component is Mongoid. So let's go ahead and add that. Another one is something called bcrypt. We're just gonna add that here. Okay. Another one is Alright, and then you can run another bundle install. And I'm going to do this. Again, you don't have to. And that's just going to install all the new packages that you added to that. So you can see that it's installed Mongoid and a bunch of others. Great. So lastly, we want to generate a Mongoid configuration file. That's just to tell this Rails project to use whatever configuration is there for MongoDB. All right. And I am just going to run tmux real quick so I can create kind of a paned windowed view of this. I can run the Rails server on the bottom and edit the files on the top. Okay, so I can run bundle execute Rails server. Okay, give it the local address as well as the port 5000, and it should all right, and we'll go back to our development. Great. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to run we're going to generate a few controllers. Or we're going to generate the controller for this static page. And we're just going to create a home page and a help page for now. Alright, so it's created a few things. Okay. You can view it in the configuration. You see that routes. It's added a static pages /home, static pages .help. If you look at the view static pages, you can see that there is a HTML file that was also created. So let's see how it works. All right, we'll head back into our browser and we'll visit static pages home, and you'll see it gets your page. Okay, if you go to help. Okay, so essentially that's the, that's pretty basic. But essentially what's happening is whenever you go to that specific URL, you have a controller, and let's the URL, Rails knows how to handle that URL by what is defined in your controller. So for example, when you go home, it'll return the home.html HTML file, web page, whatever's there. If you go to help, it knows that it'll return the help.html web page. Alright, so what happens if we go to something that we haven't defined? Something like an about page. You see that there's no route because Rails doesn't know about it. Okay, so what if we go back and we change that? And we can go to routes and it'll say, okay, let's get static pages /about. Okay, we'll save that. Let's see what happens now. you see that, okay, now Rails knows about this route, but it has no idea what to do with it. Okay, so going back again to our code, we can go back to our controller and we can help define what to do with about. And by leaving it blank, Ruby will do the default of just returning the corresponding web page. Okay? So watch, what's going to happen is that it's not going to be able to find the corresponding web page. So if I go to about, it's going to complain to say there's no template. Essentially, there's no HTML file that has the about page. Alright, so we'll go ahead and create it. So we'll create it in app/views static pages about.html.embedded Ruby. Okay, and then we'll open it up. Views static pages about, and we'll create a header saying this is the about page. And we'll save it. And now, when we go into the about route, you'll see that there's a page now. So let's review real quick. Essentially what's happening is whenever you visit a link, that information is being sent to your Ruby application, okay, your Rails application. And Rails sees that you want to hit this route, okay, the static pages about, right? And it's like, okay, I have that registered in my routes configuration. Okay, that's a registered route. And that actually gets sent to, so how do I handle that? Okay, so that gets sent to the static pages controller, because the controller will control how whatever application logic that you need to send to it. And it's like, okay, is that defined? Okay, it is defined. There's a method called about. Okay, so great. What does it tell me to do? Well, it's telling me to do nothing. Okay, when nothing happens, I'm just going to return the corresponding view or the corresponding template, which is just a web page. And that's exactly what it did. Alright guys, let's move on beyond just maybe a simple header tag or a single sentence and add a little bit more, pizzazz to our application. But before I do, I want to talk about TDD, or test-driven development. You probably already heard of it. You probably already know that's best practice. And I just want to kind of touch upon reasons why. So, you've probably already noticed that when I was creating the about page, all the back and forth and manual, all the manual work that I had to do to kind of switch between the browser and then the code. And writing tests essentially avoids that. You're essentially automating the process of checking whether or not your code works. And even though it might take a lot more time up front to write and maybe think through some of the tests that you have to kind of implement, it's always better down the road. When you initially create the application or the project, you'll see that it automatically has created a test folder. And if you list what's in test, you see that there are tests where you can test for your controllers, test for fixtures, helpers, integration, mailers, models. Essentially almost everything that you essentially would create you can test for. In the controllers folder, you see that there is a test file specifically for the static pages that we created when we generated the controllers. So if you take a look at that, you'll see that I've already created a new test called test should get contact, and you see that we already have some tests for should get home, and should get help, should get about, and essentially what we're testing for is just that the response, the HTTP response, should be a successful. So basically the file was found, or the HTML file was found. So if I run bundle exec rake test, it'll run, and you'll notice that there was one error, and that error is in the static pages controller test file, and it was really, and it generated an error log. It said no route matches contact. Alright, so just like we did with the about page, instead of having to go to the browser or anything, you're just able to check your work as you go. So, let's create the routes. Let's also create the controller, and we'll also create the HTML file. If you go back down and run the same test again, you'll notice that there's no failures this time and no errors. So everything worked out fine. So right now let's edit all our HTML files and make them a little bit more content rich, so to speak. So add that in. And I'll do home. So we've added a little bit more HTML to the application in the home, about, help, and contact pages. But notice how none of these HTML pages have your typical kind of body tags or your header tags or your titles and stuff like that. The reason for this is because of how Rails does templating, and how essentially there is a file that you can find in your project app views layouts folder called the application HTML file. And here you'll notice that this is where you can declare doc type. There's an HTML tag, your head tags with titles and things like that, and all the stuff in your body. Whatever you have in your corresponding kind of HTML document, it will fill this section called yield, and everything else surrounding it will render the exact same way for everything in the entire application. So for example, if you went to contacts, what would render in your application HTML is all this plus the information that is in your contact.html, which is this header or this h1 tag and this p tag. If you went to the help page, this will pop up in the yield section. So what's interesting is what I've added here is the to provide a title, and what this does is over here in the title tag, it asks to yield the title. So I can actually pass a variable about to here whenever you access the about page, and I can pass help to the title, and I'll render help in the title over here. And everything after that is just essentially static. So let's just see how this plays out in the browser. So you see that when we go to help, the title is help. And if we go to about, you see how it changes to about. Now what we should do, instead of checking each page in the browser, we can modify our tests to check to see if all our titles are rendering properly. Okay, so what I did here is essentially created a variable called base title, which should appear in essentially all of our current static pages in the title. But what varies is that when I go to the help section, the title should have help, this little pipe, and then that string, Ruby on Rails tutorial sample app. And if I go to the about section, it should have the title about and the pipe in the same string. If I go to the contacts, it should have contact, the pipe, and the same string. But if I go to home, I don't really need to kind of remind you you're in the home page. So let's see if that works. And if we know that the about and the help page works, but okay. So I had 4 runs, 7 assertions, okay, 3 failures and 1 error. Okay, so there was a typo. Instead of assert select, I did asset select. Let me correct that. You never want to have... So let's run this test one more time. I think there should be 2 failures because help and about should be pretty much correct based on how we checked it in the browser. Okay, so what happens is, okay, the contact page fails because there's nothing being rendered here, and the home page and nothing is rendered here. Okay. So obviously we don't want the home page to say home and the pipe. We probably just want it to say Ruby on Rails tutorial example app, right? But let's, but what we can do, we can quickly fix the contact page. So let's open the contact page, and you'll see we never provided the title variable. So we can quickly add that. Yep. And let's see if that helped with that test. Yes, and there's only 1 failure on the home page. Now what we can do is modify or create a little helper function to help us essentially account for when we're on the home page and we don't really need it to specify exactly which section of the application we're in. So we can actually enter this through the through our project folder, the app folder, and there's a specific area called helpers, and we can modify this file called the application helper. Okay, and we can add a little function that we'll call the full title. That full title will take a page title, and if it doesn't get anything, it'll default to none. And we'll say that the base title is equal to Ruby on Rails tutorial example app, as we specified in our test. And if the page title is empty, we'll just return the base title. So when we're on the home page, it's not going to pass any specific page title, so we'll just return that base title. And if the page title is not empty, then we're just going to append it with a pipe and add the base title to it. function. Alright, and what we can go is application, instead of calling yield, we'll add our full title helper function and pass in whatever's yielded by our pages into it. And because that handles the base static part of our title, we won't need that anymore either. Alright, that should help fix the error on the home page. So let's see if that worked. Yes! There's no failures. Okay, so right now our website is pretty basic. It doesn't really have much to it. Unlike most web pages out there, it doesn't really have kind of like a nav bar at the top that links you to the different sections of the website. It doesn't have a consistent footer that has additional links or information, and it has no styles, so it looks pretty ugly and basic. So why don't we close out this video by showing you how Rails helps us in that regard and extend the discussion regarding templates with the concept of partials. So instead of having the header or the footer or various aspects of the application all in this application HTML, what you could do is separate it out and create what Rails calls partials. And all you really have to do is just create a file in the layouts folder that starts with an underscore and call it something like header.html.erb. And you can add in your HTML. Let's create another one called footer. So what partials allow us to do is, instead of having everything in one page, it allows us to modularize and keep various aspects of the base template in separate little entities. So when you have to do certain things to a specific element, it doesn't have to be in a huge kind of single file. So in order to render the specific partial, you can call it like such. The other thing that we can do is, instead of always going to the static page /home, what we're going to do is also change some of these routes and define them with a name.